Breaking. A Hollywood legend's legacy didn't end with applause, it detonated into silence, secrets, and a courtroom war no one saw coming. What really happens when love, money, and grief collide behind closed doors, and why did this family fracture after the cameras turned off? In this dramatized reconstruction inspired by Hollywood's most powerful legacies, the story begins not with flashing lights or red carpets, but with a quiet, suffocating stillness that settled over Brentwood after the unthinkable loss of a legendary filmmaker and his lifelong partner. To the public, the name Rob Reiner symbolized warmth, conscience, and storytelling with heart, the man behind cultural landmarks, a voice of compassion in an industry known for excess. But behind the gates of a private home, grief unfolded in a way no script could soften. In the days following the tragedy, time seemed to blur for the family left behind. Phone calls went unanswered, curtains stayed drawn, and within that silence, something far heavier than sorrow began to take shape. It wasn't just the absence of parents. It was the growing realization that the future they assumed existed might never arrive. According to this fictionalized narrative, the family gathered quietly, avoiding public attention, declining statements, refusing interviews. There were no dramatic speeches, no public tears, only raw, unfinished grief. The farewell itself was swift and deeply private, honoring tradition, honoring faith, honoring dignity. Yet even as the ashes were returned to the family, as memories flooded back in fragments, another truth hovered in the background, unspoken but unavoidable. Documents existed. Decisions had been made long before anyone was ready to face them. And when the will was finally scheduled to be read, it wasn't grief that filled the room first. It was disbelief. Because what unfolded next didn't just redefine inheritance, it redefined what legacy meant inside this family. In this dramatized account, the fortune built over decades of creative dominance, business brilliance, and cultural impact, estimated near $200 million, had been directed almost entirely away from the family name. The wealth wasn't divided. It wasn't delayed. It wasn't negotiated. It was gone, redirected into charitable foundations, social causes, and institutions tied to values the filmmaker had championed for a lifetime. To the outside world, it looked like the ultimate act of generosity. Headlines framed it as noble, selfless, visionary. But inside that room, among the children who had just lost both parents, the moment felt like erasure. Shock hardened into silence. Silence into confusion. And confusion into something far more dangerous: resentment, fueled by unanswered questions. In this narrative, one sibling reportedly sat frozen, staring at the paperwork as if rereading it might change reality. Another couldn't hold back, breaking down, questioning whether love could coexist with such finality. Lawyers' names surfaced quietly at first, mentioned in hushed tones, then written down, then dialed. Because when grief collides with feeling forgotten, it doesn't stay quiet for long. And just as the family tried to mourn in peace, the outside world began circling. Cameras appeared. Speculation exploded. Paparazzi camped outside law offices. Every movement was dissected. Every silence interpreted. Why were they meeting attorneys so soon? Had the will been validated? Was there a legal loophole? In this dramatized telling, the children didn't speak, but their body language said everything. Sunglasses hiding sleepless eyes. Black clothing worn not for show, but because nothing else felt right. This wasn't about greed. It was about identity. About whether a lifetime of being someone's child could be overwritten by a final philosophical statement. And just when the public thought the story was simple charity versus inheritance, cracks began to appear. Friends hinted that this decision wasn't impulsive, that it reflected beliefs held for years. Beliefs about independence, about struggle, about not shielding children from hardship. But beliefs, no matter how principled, don't always translate cleanly when loss is fresh and wounds are open. In this fictionalized account, that's where the true conflict ignites, not in a courtroom yet, but in the emotional gap between intention and impact. Because the question no one could answer was devastatingly simple: was this a final lesson, or a final goodbye that went too far? And as the family stood at the edge of a legal storm, still clutching ashes instead of answers, one truth became unavoidable: this wasn't just the end of a life. It was the beginning of a battle over meaning, memory, and what children are owed when love is expressed through absence. And that realization would pull them deeper into a story far darker, far more public, and far more painful than anyone ever imagined. As this dramatized Hollywood narrative continues, the silence surrounding the family didn't protect them, it amplified everything. Within days, what had been private grief transformed into a public spectacle shaped by whispers, leaked details, and relentless speculation. In this fictional reconstruction, the moment cameras captured the siblings entering a prestigious Beverly Hills law firm, the story crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Images spread within minutes, framed by headlines suggesting an inheritance war, a legal revolt, a family turning against its own legacy. To outsiders, it looked calculated. To those inside the storm, it felt unavoidable. Grief does not pause just because the world is watching. And when unanswered questions begin to suffocate, people reach for clarity even if that clarity lives inside courtrooms and legal briefs. According to sources portrayed in this dramatized account, the siblings weren't searching for money at first. They were searching for explanation. Why had everything been redirected? Why had no conversation prepared them for this outcome? Why did it feel like the final chapter had been written without them in the room? Inside the law firm's cold marble halls, exhaustion hung heavier than ambition. Legal experts reportedly explained that challenging a will tied to charitable foundations was no small task. These weren't casual donations. They were carefully constructed trusts, layered with intent, reinforced by years of documentation. In this narrative, each clause felt like a locked door. Each signature felt final. And yet, emotion doesn't respect legal certainty. One sibling, overwhelmed, allegedly broke down, repeating the same question over and over, not about dollars, but about belonging. Another reacted with anger sharper than grief, expressing the feeling that the world had been chosen over family, principle over presence. Outside, reporters shouted questions that echoed cruelly against the walls. Was the will valid? Who controlled the estate now? Would the children fight back? The questions didn't sound like curiosity, they sounded like accusations. In this fictionalized portrayal, the siblings said nothing, but the weight of those moments reshaped their resolve. That's when the narrative introduces the attorneys, figures known in Hollywood circles for dismantling what others consider untouchable. Legal minds who specialize not in simple inheritance disputes, but in emotional earthquakes disguised as paperwork. In private consultations, the tone shifted. This was no longer about shock. It was about strategy. Lawyers began combing through timelines, medical records, correspondence, anything that could suggest the final decisions were influenced by emotional strain, isolation, or unresolved family fractures. Not to smear a legacy, but to reinterpret it. The argument forming wasn't that charity was wrong, it was that exclusion felt absolute. That a lifetime of love couldn't logically end in total detachment. In this dramatized telling, one lawyer warned them plainly fighting charitable foundations tied to a beloved public figure would ignite backlash. Public opinion would turn ruthless. Online narratives would paint villains long before a judge ever ruled. But grief doesn't calculate optics. It reacts. And as the legal plan slowly took shape, something deeper surfaced: resentment mixed with guilt. The children weren't just afraid of losing the case. They were afraid of losing their parents twice. Once to death, and again to public myth. Because while the world celebrated a symbol of compassion, they were living inside unanswered silence. This is where the story tightens, where suspense coils. Because just as legal theories began forming, revelations about the past started to surface. Conversations recalled by old friends. Statements about independence. Beliefs about struggle as a teacher. Ideas that now felt less like wisdom and more like abandonment when viewed through the lens of loss. In this narrative, the siblings began to wonder whether the very values they were raised on had become barriers instead of bridges. Whether strength had been mistaken for distance. And as legal teams prepared for what would become a long, emotionally draining confrontation, one truth emerged clearly: this wasn't a rebellion against charity. It was a rebellion against finality. Against the idea that a parent's last word could erase a child's sense of place. And just when it seemed the conflict had reached its peak, new details about the past, about philosophy, intention, and unspoken fears began to rise to the surface, setting the stage for an even more painful revelation in the next chapter of this story. In this dramatized continuation, the legal battle paused just long enough for the past to come rushing in, because understanding the will meant understanding the mind that created it. Friends, colleagues, and longtime associates began surfacing with memories that reframed everything. According to this fictionalized account, the filmmaker had spoken often, sometimes casually, sometimes with startling conviction, about what he believed parents owed their children and what they did not. To him, love was not measured in financial security but in resilience. He believed inherited wealth could quietly erode purpose, dull urgency, and trap people inside expectations they never chose. These weren't ideas formed at the end of life. They were convictions carried for decades, shaped by Hollywood excess, by watching families fracture under the weight of money meant to protect them. In this narrative, he often said that struggle wasn't cruelty, it was preparation. That identity built without hardship was fragile. And while those words sounded noble in theory, they landed very differently after death. Especially for children who never got the chance to challenge them, soften them, or simply ask why. As the siblings' legal team reconstructed timelines, a portrait emerged of a man deeply consistent in philosophy, but emotionally distant in execution. He saw strength in his children, believed in their independence, trusted they would survive without him perhaps too much. One child, portrayed as already established, was seen as proof that the philosophy worked. Another, immersed in creative uncertainty, was believed to be building something meaningful without shortcuts. And the third, who struggled more visibly, became the most complicated piece of the puzzle. In this dramatized telling, the father feared that wealth would not heal pain, it would amplify it. That protection could become permission to avoid growth. And so, from his perspective, withholding inheritance wasn't punishment. It was restraint. But restraint, when delivered through a will instead of a conversation, becomes something else entirely. As lawyers gathered journals, emails, and private notes, the intention became clearer, but no less painful. The will wasn't written in anger. It was written in certainty. A certainty that assumed time would eventually do what dialogue never did. That assumption proved fatal to family unity. Because certainty leaves no room for interpretation, and grief thrives on questions. In this narrative, the siblings weren't just fighting legal language, they were fighting a philosophy that had outlived its author. Publicly, the filmmaker's legacy expanded. Tributes poured in. Documentaries replayed his activism. Foundations praised his foresight. But privately, the children felt eclipsed by an image they couldn't compete with. How do you argue against generosity without sounding ungrateful? How do you express hurt without being labeled entitled? That tension became unbearable. In closed meetings, the siblings reportedly admitted something they never said out loud before, that this wasn't about needing money. It was about needing acknowledgement. A final affirmation that they mattered not just as individuals, but as family. The absence of any personal provision felt symbolic, as if love had been abstracted into causes instead of people. And yet, every document they reviewed reinforced the same truth: this outcome was intentional, planned, reinforced. The deeper they went, the harder it became to separate grief from rebellion. Their attorneys warned that challenging intent would require questioning emotional state, isolation, influence lines that could blur dangerously close to rewriting history. But the siblings felt trapped. Accepting the will meant accepting a narrative where they were strong enough to be left behind. Fighting it meant risking public judgment and the possible unraveling of a legacy they still loved. This is where the story turns inward, where the suspense sharpens not through action but through realization. The values that defined their childhood, independence, accountability, resilience, were now the very weapons cutting them off from closure. The father believed his children would understand someday. The children realized too late that understanding doesn't equal healing. And as the case moved closer to open confrontation, one haunting question echoed through every strategy session, every sleepless night, every memory replayed on a loop: can love survive when its final expression feels like abandonment? That question, unresolved and heavy, carried them straight into the most explosive phase, yet where grief, law, and legacy would collide in full public view. In this dramatized final chapter, the story reaches its most volatile point as grief, philosophy, and public perception collide in a way no legal strategy can fully contain. As preparations for a courtroom confrontation intensify, the family's private sorrow becomes inseparable from a global narrative hungry for heroes and villains. Foundations tied to the estate release carefully worded statements honoring intent and impact. Industry figures defend the vision. Commentators argue that generosity should never be punished. Yet behind closed doors, the siblings brace for something far more personal than a verdict: the permanent reshaping of how their parents will be remembered and how they themselves will be judged. In this fictional reconstruction, the legal team lays out a case not against charity, but against absolutes. They argue that legacy is not a ledger. It is a living relationship between intention and consequence. They question whether certainty hardened into distance, whether principles eclipsed presence, whether a final decision, however consistent, ignored the emotional reality of those left behind. Across the aisle, counsel for the foundations counters with a calm, devastating simplicity. The will reflects a lifetime of belief, meticulously documented, thoughtfully executed, and free of coercion. The courtroom becomes a theater where values themselves are cross-examined. Independence versus care, purpose versus protection, love expressed through restraint versus love expressed through provision. As testimony unfolds, the public watches for cracks, any sign of regret, any hint of doubt. But doubt is hard to prove when conviction is written in ink. Outside the courthouse, cameras frame every entrance and exit, parsing faces for guilt or resolve. Inside, the siblings sit with the unbearable truth that winning could cost them the image of the parents they loved, while losing could cement a feeling of being written out of their own story. In this telling, the most powerful moment doesn't come from a legal maneuver, but from a pause and admission whispered in a hallway that no ruling can return a conversation that never happened. The trial presses forward anyway, because sometimes the pursuit of justice is also the pursuit of voice. And as arguments crescendo, the realization settles in that the battle is not truly about money or even control, but about meaning, who gets to define it, and at what cost. When proceedings adjourn for the final time, whatever the outcome, something irreversible has occurred. A family has been forced to litigate love in public, to translate grief into claims, to stand in the shadow of a legacy that now belongs as much to the world as it ever did to them. The applause that once followed the name now echoes differently, layered with questions no press release can answer. And that is where this story leaves us, not with a neat resolution, but with a haunting reflection. In this dramatized account inspired by Hollywood's most complicated truths, generosity becomes both gift and wound, and principles outlive the people who forged them. We are left to ask whether legacy is measured by impact alone, or by the quiet assurances shared with those closest to us before time runs out. Can a final act be both noble and painful? Can children honor a vision while still grieving the absence it creates? As the world continues to celebrate the causes advanced, the change achieved, and the lives touched, a family wrestles with the human cost of certainty. Perhaps the hardest lesson here is that values, when delivered without dialogue, can feel like distance even when born from love. So what do you think? Is leaving everything to the world the ultimate act of compassion, or does love require a final, personal embrace? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories that peel back the layers of power, legacy, and the truths hidden behind public applause, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because some stories don't end with the credits. They linger long after the spotlight fades.